with Nike on a solution to a problem that plagues the whole industry, not just Nike, but Nike has been willing to support the team in looking for a solution to a very useful but toxic solvent. And I want to, in addition to the people that I thanked and acknowledged that before our first presentation, I wanted to acknowledge Renee Hackemiller-Curtis, who's here from Portland, right?
Beaverton technically, but no one knows where Beaverton is, so we just say Portland.
The Portland area, greater metropolitan area, and has supported this team throughout with technical information and background, and will presumably be here to ask and maybe even answer questions. So go ahead.
Great, thank you. So we are the Nike team. My name is Kim Hazard. I'm a second-year master's student in environmental health sciences.
I'm sorry, I'm a second-year MPH student in industrial hygiene.
Hi, I'm Annie. I'm a third-year PhD student in mechanical engineering.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm a second-year MPH student in environmental health sciences.
And Isaac Ramphal is going to be joining us via FaceTime. He is our resident chemist. He's a PhD candidate in chemistry, and he'll be joining us for Q&A. So today we'll be talking about our exploration into alternatives to DMF-based polyurethane synthetic leather. This is a bit of a roadmap for where we're going today, so we're going to give you some important context, dive into how we approached our challenge, and spend a lot of time in these two buckets of our strategies, and then wrap up with discussion. So let's get into it. So dimethlyformamide, or DMF for short, is used extensively for manufacturing synthetic leather, and it's been used for decades, and due to its solvent properties, it can be found throughout the textiles and apparel industry. Many companies, including Nike, but also many other apparel brands, use DMF in the production of polyurethane synthetic leather, specifically for footwear. And DMF, unfortunately, is easily absorbed through the skin and respiratory systems and can cause liver damage and other adverse health outcomes. So special attention has been paid to the use of DMF in the textile industry and apparel industry, specifically due to Greenpeace's detox campaign, which launched in 2011. Which meant to highlight the issues around environmental contamination related to the use of hazardous chemicals in the manufacturing of textiles and apparel. They specifically called out Nike, among other brands, in a report showing measurable levels of DMF and other chemicals in products sold as part of the 2014 World Cup. But we know that tackling DMF, the use of DMF at Nike, will have a really significant impact. So it consists of approximately 10% of Nike's total hazardous chemical usage. And Nike, due to regulatory challenges as well as health concerns, has announced that they will phase out DMF use for synthetic leather by 2025. In 2014, they led the first industry-aligned MRSL, which is a manufacturing restricted substances list, as part of the ZDHC coalition, which is an industry-led coalition that aims to have zero discharge of hazardous chemicals. And a couple years later, Nike announced their Moonshot Challenge. Sorry, trying to get the cursor out of the way here. To ultimately double their business while having half of the environmental impact, which they define as carbon emissions, use of fresh water, as well as use of controversial chemicals. And so that leads us to this overall view of Nike's sustainability goals. So leading the way towards carbon neutrality, thinking about taking waste out of the value chain, supporting people, working people in the supply chain, as well as this critical piece of sustainable chemistry, which is where we'll be focusing today. So why is DMF so commonly used? DMF is a polar aprotic solvent that was first synthesized in the late 19th century by French chemists, and it's widely used, as I've mentioned. It's miscible with water and many other organic solvents. It remains in a liquid state over a wide range of temperatures, and it dissolves polyurethane as well as glues, dyes, and surfactants. And it's incredibly inexpensive for just dollars per pound and produced at industrial scale.
So the process for making this synthetic leather that we've talked about is pretty complicated. So we've tried to simplify it with this little cartoon here. So it's called a roller-to-roller process generally. So you have these rollers of fabric where the fabric is like sent along this complicated conveyor system, and it moves through the wet process and the dry process. Both are baths that have DMF in them. The wet just refers to there's also water. The dry, there's no water. And then it has water washing baths in an oven. So this is just like a simplified process, but it's really important to understand that these are big open baths, that the DMF is reused for reused almost isn't even the right word, because it's just continuously moving through these full baths of water. And so when your final product looks like this, where you have a woven substrate, which can be cotton or polyester or any other woven fabric, and then you have these layers of PU that are added through these baths. So this is a really simplified version, but I think it gives you a sense of the whole process and what the containers of DMF look like, because it's not necessarily intuitive if you're familiar with other manufacturing processes.
So DMF is inherently hazardous to human health. It is, as I've mentioned, easily absorbed through the respiratory and dermal system, and it has several adverse health outcomes, but the liver is its primary target. So liver toxicity is what we're really concerned about, but also it is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a probable human carcinogen. So we have these endpoints here for carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, developmental and reproductive toxicity, endocrine activity, neurotoxicity, and skin and eye irritation. And these are some potential mechanisms for how DMF becomes toxic in the body. Really the main and most fleshed out pathway is through metabolism of DMF, and then via that metabolism you have glutathione depletion leading to oxidative stress. I won't get into the mechanics of all these other potential pathways, but you see the endpoints of apoptosis, cell necrosis, and alteration of gut microbiota community, which can all, while this all relates to liver toxicity, you can see that these are potential pathways for carcinogenicity or mutagenicity as well.
So thinking about the routes of exposure, which is our dermal and respiratory, we are primarily concerned with the threat DMF posed to workers who have direct contact to DMF. And this graph summarizes 3 studies that were done on occupational DMF exposures in synthetic leather factories in China and Taiwan. The y-axis are the occupational exposure levels, and the y-axis are the processes that involves DMF. The middle line refers to the permissible exposure limits in the US and recommendations in China, and the green bars are the ranges of exposure in these 2 processes. And we can see in this graph that the workers in the wet process are exposed to much higher concentration of DMF compared to the dry process. At the highest point, workers are exposed to 10 times the regulatory limit in the wet process. So obviously it's higher as seen in this graph in the wet process compared to the dry process. So at the highest point in the wet process, exposure can be 10 times the regulatory limit, and that's 3 times in the dry process. In a different study, it was measured to be 13 times the limit. And just relating back to the health endpoints, at 1/3 of the regulatory limit, studies have shown DMF exposure to induce liver injury. So in general, but DMF exposure is considered as a lower risk to consumer and environment because it is wash off and bake off in the process that we just described earlier. but it is really important for us to address this exposure because in the interest to protect workers' health.
So, with the serious health concerns of occupational exposure to DMF in mind, as well as Nike's moonshot goal of drastically reducing their impact on the environment, we set out to identify inherently safer alternatives to synthetic leather made with DMF to protect worker health and support Nike's goal of phasing out the use of DMF by 2025.
Great. So now that we kind of know a little bit about DMF's background and some of the issues behind it, we'll go into the approach of the solutions that we're looking into. And so this figure shows different places to intervene in the system in which we could expect to reduce or eliminate the use of DMF. This spectrum not only kind of shows ease of intervention, but also kind of represents a continuum of time, capital investment, and also in a lot of ways kind of the way we think about what shoes are. So kind of starting from the right side, we have solutions that are potentially less disruptive. Starting on the left, we have drop-in replacements. So this would entail kind of switching out DMF and replacing it with a different solvent. Next over, we have a process change. So that's thinking about changing the process in which PU synthetic leather is created. During this presentation, we'll talk about a process change called PU dispersion. Next over in the middle, we have the material change, which is like it sounds like, changing out the material, but staying in this realm of artificial leather. These are the three places of intervention that we'll be focusing on specifically in our presentation, kind of moving beyond the scope of this project. Some other different places of intervention could be potentially a radical material change, so moving away from what we think of when we, kind of moving away from the idea of what leather kind of looks and feels like. An example of this could be the Allbirds shoe, which is made from trino, which is a combination of tree material and merino wool. And finally, at the end, it could be something that's a little bit more disruptive. It's a radical swoosh change, so potentially kind of changing what we think of when we think of kind of the branding of Nike and what we recognize a Nike shoe to be. So for all of our solutions, we had the goals. There were a lot of things that we could have considered, but there were certain design goals that we pared down to that we want all of our alternatives to have. One is that our solution reduces or eliminates DMF from the process to reduce health risk. The second, we've talked about it a lot, but meeting Nike's other sustainability goals. The third is having the same performance as existing solutions in terms of strength, durability, and aesthetic. And finally, the last thing is we want to avoid toxic substitutions. So in other words, we're wanting to avoid solutions that have a similar hazard profile as DMF. For example, so we already know from Nike that some manufacturers are switching over to dimethylformamide or DMAC, but Nike has acknowledged that the toxicity information that we have about it isn't kind of better enough to justify switching out DMF to DMAC. And then also, so synthetic PU leathers kind of have different performance metrics, and then also aesthetic considerations that it has to meet. So it has to meet strength requirements, so it needs to be flexible and durable enough to be stitched onto a shoe. It needs to also be strong enough for athletic use. Also, there's a lot of aesthetic measures that we're wanting to meet, so bright colors. As we know, Nike has a lot of shoes that use bright color palettes. Also, we're wanting to make sure that it's color fast, so it's staying on, it's not rubbing off on yourself or on other materials, and also we want to make sure it's standing up to UV degradation. And then also we do see with PU, PU synthetic leather, we do think of it with a certain feel, like a hand feel and a certain aesthetic, but we do see this as an opportunity for potentially making changes because there are a lot of leather, that's kind of a more subjective quality, and there's a lot of leathers out there that have different aesthetics and different feels to them. So we kind of want to set you up to understand later parts of our presentation, so we also want to frame the hazard assessment that we've done. So we want to understand kind of the inherent hazard behind some of the chemicals that we'll be talking about later. In order to kind of do this hazard assessment, we looked in different spots. So the first place that we looked at is that authoritative list, for example, REACH, which is an EU regulation. It's just a database that has a lot of chemicals in it that we found very helpful. Also, we did broad literature searches and found a lot of information there. And then also just understanding the physical properties gave us a lot of intuition about how we thought the chemicals might act. And then also to touch on, we did do some modeling of chemicals and then also their metabolites. For the purposes of our presentation, we didn't find this spot too helpful. And also we wanted to be able to look at our solutions in a comparative way. So we also use different tools to rank them. And a couple of different spots we kind of went to was the globally harmonized system, so the GHS categories, which is the system for standardizing chemicals and kind of their labeling. And then we also use Green Screen, which provides a score based on a lot of different authoritative bodies. And then we also use the Hodge-Sterner Index, which ranks toxicity based on acute tox data.
So we're gonna move into drop-in replacement. Drop-in replacement to DMF are our first and most exciting strategy, so we'll be focusing a lot of our time in this section. Compared to our other strategies with material change and process change, drop-in replacement will be a considerably lower capital investment. It also offers broad cross-industry impact, as DMF is not only used as a solvent in synthetic leather production. So while this change is incremental, we have to remember that DMF use consists of 10% of Nike's overall hazardous chemical usage. So by utilizing something that is more environmental and health friendly, we'll be making a great impact on Nike's chemical footprint. And also, this substitution is easily achievable in the current PU process, so without even have to change manufacturers. So these are the design criteria we use to start our selection of our drop-in recommendations. The substitute should dissolve PU, have good physical properties that are similar to DMF, which is high boiling point, low volatility, and be miscible with water. And it should be an overall improvement on health and environmental performance. And ideally, our solution can maximize on all three of these criteria.
So the space for solvents is really large, right? You can think about there's like classes of alcohols that are solvents. So we really wanted to figure out how do we look at the right kind of solvents. There's no papers that say, hey, this is a solvent, it dissolves PU, great, move forward with it. There's like no literature on that. So we had to pick some sort of framework to start. So we used these three categories to justify kind of where we took our big list of potential candidates from. So the first one is up at the top. So it's solid phase peptide synthesis. So this is a peptide synthesis. So this little diagram like represents like a protein. And the amide bonds in that kind of resemble the polyurethane linkages. So there is some hope that the solvents that are used in that process would also work for polyurethane. Over here we have the bio-based feedstock. This is like a little bowl of sugar. These are solvents that are derived from glucose, which we think is really exciting because this would hit like multiple of Nike's targets in that triangle that we showed you at the beginning, where we now have a renewable feedstock and less health impact. And then this other category over here with a needle injecting into a brain is pretty representative. So other places in the literature, there are some pretty powerful solvents that kind of fall in this category similar to the polar products that maybe don't have a lot of data, don't fall into these other two categories, but they're used in pharmaceutical and like the industry for a solvent in like injecting into the spine or the brain. So that's why that picture ended up there. So that's a really big, even though we've narrowed it to kind of these three places, this is still a really large list. So we narrowed this initially to a shorter candidate list where we eliminated anything that was like a cyanide, right? Like really like a red flag. We also tried to take a representative candidate from like a list. So we have one ketol on our list, which tries to kind of represent a very large class of potential solvents, but we only chose to put one on that list. And then from that list, we spent quite a bit of time, and we're going to talk to you today about how we actually narrowed that list that we started with into what we're recommending Nike move forward with today. So, without further ado, this was our full candidate list. Up here we have traditional polar aprotic solvents. These are the ones that are used in industry right now. They are red, right? These are the ones that have bad tox endpoints, but they have physical properties, and they dissolve PU, and they have all of these other good things. So they're here as a point of comparison. So this is our largest category, the bio-based renewables, the solid phase peptide synthesis, and then other. We're not expecting you to read all of these right now, but we'll walk you through kind of the ones that we're going to focus on. So to narrow this list, we started with the physical, So we're going to talk about how we narrowed this list. So to narrow this list, we started with the physical properties. We kind of ranked here first because we had the highest confidence in the physical properties. These are things that we can look up in tables. There's no real uncertainty bars on boiling point, miscible with water. Then we moved into, does it solvate PU? We focused on this as our design criteria rather than any of the other uses that DMF might have, dissolving some of the other things in the ingredients list, or there's been talk that DMF actually acts as a stabilizer in the system. We don't focus on any of that. We've just narrowed to this one goal, which we think is probably the hardest goal, which is dissolving PU. When we've narrowed this list, we're then going to tell you about the amazing opportunity in the health and environmental performance, and also if there's any literature that doesn't necessarily fall into these categories, but makes it an exciting solution. So, physical properties. So we've talked about boiling point, vapor pressure, miscible with water. Why are these important? So I showed you this process before. These large vats of chemicals need to stay liquid. So if it's volatile and in the air, that's where we get the risk to the user. So it needs to have low volatility, high boiling point, such that it stays in these vats. The miscible with water portion comes in because we mentioned briefly, there's not a picture in this diagram, but to remove the DMF and whatever the replacement solvent would be, we would use a water bath in the same way that the current process does. So it needs to be miscible with water such that we can wash it out. So based on those properties, which only a couple properties, we came up with this list. So all of the ones in gray, we've removed from consideration for our list of recommendations. So we've cut our list in half just through physical properties. So now we're moving to how do we predict if it will solvate PU. So when you think about how something dissolves, you want to think like dissolves like. So we're trying to use Hansen solubility parameters, which are the dispersion forces, the polar interactions, and the hydrogen bonding. These three different interactions kind of make up this spherical space. And so you can imagine that PU is at the center, right? So PU would fall at the center of this spherical space that exists. In each of our solvents, we're going to try to map in 3D space to this PU. So you want closer is better in 3D space. And so from that, we're going to take a 3D distance, and we're going to try to rank them based on the distance in the solubility sphere. So we found the solubility parameters from PU, not of the actual formulations that the factories use, because that we don't know. But in the literature, there's a couple places where we talk about what the actual Hansen solubility parameters of PU are, and then they also talk about kind of that radius of the sphere that it works. So without further ado, the very large plot. So on the x-axis here, we have the distance in that 3D space from DMF, but the one that we really are worried about is the distance in that 3D space from polyurethane. So that's what this represents. So further down on the graph is more expected to dissolve PU. Some of the papers recommended that 9 is kind of the cutoff for the solubility sphere. So that's what this is, but that actually had a standard deviation of 4. So that's why there's this bar above it. So actually DMF, you can see, is actually here. So DMF is actually at a 9, and that, or an 8, and that works for this. So we've eliminated anything that falls in the gray up here, and what we're left with on our list is just the ones that fall in the white space. So using that, we were actually able to narrow our list to just these 5 chemicals, which is a much more reasonable list to direct Nike to look at.
Great. So moving from our big space of candidates into our shorter list of recommendations, we have our top 5 here, which as Annie has well explained, all meet our physical property and technical performance criteria. So now we're going to explore health and environmental endpoints for all of these. And so in the peachy color, we have our bio-based solvents. In the green, we have our SPPS solvent, and then our catch-all in blue for other. And so we'll be talking about styrene, GVL, DMI, CPME, and glycopyrrol. We'll mostly use the acronyms because these are a whole lot of word soup. So no need to try and decipher all of this right now. We're going to walk you through the whole process. So in terms of our methods for how we evaluated health and environmental performance of our recommendations, we've mentioned that we were looking at GHS categories. So we took all the available data that we could standardize to the globally harmonized system, get those numerical values for the categories, and then translate that using green screen per endpoint to get this high, medium, low risk rating or hazard rating. And what you'll see in our hazard tables are kind of the end product of endpoints that have sufficient data to show. We didn't want to show you massive tables that are all gray. So for example, we know that neurotoxicity and endocrine disruption are concerns for solvents, and yet there's no data to report for that. So what we have are just the endpoints that we feel comfortable showing you. For carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reproductive and developmental toxicity, we found that the ratings were all the same across all of those endpoints, so we've made that one big category, which is a really important endpoint, so we want to stress that. For most of our endpoints, again, we're using green screen, but for acute toxicity, we're looking at the Hodge-Sterner scale, which ranks 1 through 5, and then for persistence and bioaccumulation, we did an assessment of the log KOW for our entire candidate list and found that none of them were expected to bioaccumulate. So for persistence, in terms of how it endures in the environment, if you see a moderate under PB, since none of them are expected to bioaccumulate, that's an indication that it's there's potential for persistence there. So the way we ranked it is if it's green, then it's neither persistent or bioaccumulative. If it's yellow, then it's either one. And then for irritation, we focused on skin and respiratory irritation only.
So next, I'll be focusing on 3 of our bio-based solutions. And again, kind of echoing what Annie said, we're really excited about bio-based because they're renewable, they're grown from feedstocks, these are all derived from glucose, and we expect them to be more biodegradable than alternatives that are made from petroleum. So the first I'll focus on is styrene. Again, it's bio-based, and the feedstock is available, but it's currently not widely available by industrial or commercial production, but we do think it is commercially feasible. And this was a great option that emerged from green solvents literature. And I'll just walk you kind of throughout all of our chemicals, we will be comparing them across the board to DMF, which is, of course, what's used right now. So as you can see across the board, styrene is an improvement in all of these endpoints from DMF. We do see low hazard across the board, except for in acute toxicity, you'll see a moderate hazard. Next, we'll talk about dimethyl isosorbide, which is called DMI, again, bio-based. So the reason why this ended up in our recommended list is because it actually had the closest Hansen solubility parameters that Annie just talked about to polyurethane. It is currently available for commercial production and is at industrial scale. We are pretty excited about this, or have a good feel about it, because currently it's used widely in pharmaceutical and cosmetic applications. And for DMI as compared to DMF, again, better across the board with all of these endpoints. It's low for CMR, irritation, acute toxicity, and aquatic. And again, we don't expect these chemicals to be bioaccumulative, but it is moderate at persistence. And for systemic, we didn't have sufficient data, so that's a data gap right there. And then finally, our last bio-based solution is GVL. Again, it is bio-based, and similar to styrene, the feedstock is available, but it's not currently widely used industrial or commercial production scale currently, but we do think it is commercially feasible. We did have a good feeling about this as well because its flavor constituents are the same thing you'd find in like mango or honey. And then we did have on this, for GVL, we did see that there was potential concern based on modeling data in carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and developmental and repro tox via modeling. So we kind of wanted to flag this as a potential kind of a top spot to start doing some research on. But across the board, again, for irritation, acute toxicity, persistence of bioaccumulation, we have low hazard, and then for aquatic toxicity, moderate hazard. But still across the board, seeming better than DMF.
So moving into our SPPS space, which is solid phase peptide synthesis, we're really excited about this approach or this category because, again, the amide bonds are very close to PU, and so we think it could be a really effective solvent. And CPME, cyclopentyl methyl ether, was highlighted as a green solvent in SPPS literature. It did not meet the threshold for any classification for via REACH data for carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, or reprotox. It has some skin but not respiratory irritation. There is a little bit of concern around aquatic tox, but it didn't, again, meet that threshold for classification. And it is not expected to bioaccumulate, but there is potential for persistence just based on its structure. And finally, for our deep dive into each one of these, we have our other space of glycofurol. And this really has popped up in terms of pharmaceutical formulations as being generally regarded as non-toxic for pharmaceutical injections and other types of drug delivery. And it actually has the potential to be bio-based, so it could move into that other category, but it needs a little finessing. However, you can see a lot of data gaps here, but we feel confident based on its pharmaceutical applications that it could have a much better health profile than DMF for sure.
All right. So we just gave you the drop-in recommendations. Now we're going to move into the process and material change.
Oh yeah. Just one more summary.
Oh, just one more summary?
Right?
That's right.
Yes.
You've already seen this information.
So this is not new information, but as you can see, everything does perform better on our recommendations compared to DMF. We do, again, want to flag this model data, which is not experimental, but we do really think that that's like kind of the first place to start looking for clues about toxicity. And we set our own design criteria for technical performance and used physical properties as a proxy for that. But obviously, any of these solvents would have to be tested in the manufacturing. As I mentioned, we are concerned about neurotoxicity and endocrine disruption potential effects for any solvent, but we just did not find sufficient data to report back to you. So those are definitely next steps that need to be addressed first and foremost. And again, just to reiterate that the full list of all of our candidates, I think there's still a lot of promise there, and I don't want to just completely knock those off the list, but our top 5 recommendations are really like guidance for where to go next.
Now, I guess we'll move on to the process and the material change, starting first with the process change, moving up that disruption timeline that you saw at the beginning. So we're going to talk about 2 process changes. The first one is PU dispersion, and the second one is alternative backbone chemistry. These have 2 very different levels of development. PU dispersion is ready tomorrow to kind of go in and make polyurethane. The alternative backbone chemistry is years away and could be its own green solutions project in a future year. So starting with polyurethane dispersion. So this has lots of different names in the industry depending on who your supplier is, right? It's a aqueous polyurethane dispersion, solvent-free, waterborne polyurethane dispersion, but they all kind of mean the same thing, where you're replacing the primary solvent of DMF with water as your primary solvent. So in your ingredient pools, you have the polyols and the isocyanates, which make up your polyurethane backbone, water, and then a water dispersing monomer that tries to do some of the same things that these reactive solvents would do in terms of physical properties of the final product. So this is a plot that shows kind of the overall polyurethane dispersion growth over time from 2014 to 2020 predicted. But this is important to see that this is an industry that's growing, but not necessarily a synthetic leather industry that's growing. But right, TFL, Bayer, Evonik all have these processes on the market that they're using with suppliers right now. So these processes are really cool because you could reduce or eliminate the need for DMF like completely in your process. They also have water and energy savings. Even though this is water as a solvent, you're eliminating the water wash step and the oven cure to try to get rid of that excess solvent at the end. So you have the ability to hit more points on that Nike triangle of sustainability goals. Also, there's some evidence that some of these formulations are actually more abrasive resistance. For when you think about your shoes, that could be a really big perk of the leather that's on your shoes that you scuff up all day. However, there's potential concerns. The first is capital investment. It's a much higher capital investment over some of the drop-in replacements that we've already discussed. We don't necessarily know that it's a complete elimination of DMF. We assume that it's a huge reduction in DMF, but due to proprietary issues, we can't actually see all of the nuances of all of these processes. There are some additional concerns with the color and quality of this process. There's a reason that we use DMF. It makes really good polyurethane. So if you're using something else like water that's not as reactive, maybe you're not getting the same type of polyurethane quality, even though they're saying that it's better, right? How much do you trust marketing materials? And additionally, it's true, right? The color is really important. That color palette that Nike needs is really important for their shoes. And then the water dispersing monomers, which they, right, of course, in their marketing materials kind of downplay, could actually have huge health and safety concerns. One of them in particular, Cosmos 19 actually has like red in many of the health categories that we've talked about. Now, we still think that even if these water dispersing monomers were used, there would be at much lower levels than DMF is currently used, so the risk would be lower even if the inherent hazard of those is high. So the next alternative that I want to just touch on briefly, just because I think that it's really exciting as somebody who works with polymers, is alternative backbone chemistry. So the diisocyanates in the polyurethane, shown here, so this is a polyurethane with a urethane linkage in it, that's the polyol isocyanate. So the isocyanates really drive the need for aggressive solvents. Not all polymers need solvents like that, but it is really characteristic of a polyurethane. But if you could replace this isocyanate with something that maybe is less toxic in and of itself, because isocyanates have their own health concerns, it's something that doesn't need DMF, you could eliminate that need for any aggressive solvent altogether. Again, this is like really a reach goal, but I just thought it would be like really cool to mention that the opportunity space here is really broad. Next, okay.
So another strategy of ours is a complete material change into alternative leather materials. And we have categorized, I've listed 3 categories here, and we have categorized them by their closeness to market readiness. And you can see from the scale, natural fiber welding is currently at the closest to market ready, followed by mycelium leather, and then our category of other grown proteins. And by other grown proteins, we mean leather that are grown from yeast, bacteria, and cactus. But because they are least scalable and that we have the most uncertainty regarding this category, we will be excluding them from further discussion. So starting with a lesser market-ready material, that's the mushroom or mycelium leather, and is a leather grown from the vegetative tissue of the fungi. This process is actually exemplified by 2 companies nearby, Microworks and Bell Threads, and both of their formulation is simple and similar. So the mycelium can be grown into fibrous networks, and based on the feedstock, which usually consists of agricultural waste like corn cobs, rice hulls, and sawdust, it can be grown into different patterns, colors, and whatever physical properties desired. And after the network is grown large enough, it is compressed and treated to what it looks like in a picture there. So while both companies have claimed that this process has improvements on the fact that it eliminates harmful chemicals, it is carbon neutral, 100% biodegradable, and it's comparable in strength to conventional leathers. But we still have a lot of uncertainty in their processes, especially in the treatment process that was mentioned. And comparing to our other recommendation of natural fiber welding, the cost of this process will be higher, and it would take longer. And so while this is a really interesting strategy, more knowledge will be needed into their processes and the treatment process for us to be really confident in this strategy. So now we're gonna move on into our most exciting and interesting strategy of natural fiber welding. So natural fiber welding is a patented synthetic leather production process in which epoxidized natural oils are used, such as epoxidized soybean oil, and it is cross-linked with using citric acid and small alcohols such as isopropanol, and that's showing this mechanism here. It only takes 5 to 30 minutes of processing time, and it's claimed to have resulting material that looks and behaves similar to natural leather. So looking at the hazard profile of this NFW process, the important ingredients such as the raw and epoxidized soybean oil is expected to be safe as soybean oil is consumed in large quantities. And looking at this hazard table specifically, the oils are what's the necessary ingredients along with citric acid, and here are some of the small alcohols that may be used in the process. And across the board, we see a lot of green, and that's great. But what's concerning is the acetone co-solvent and the nitrogen-containing catalyst, such as quinoline. While these two are used to make this process faster. So if you don't need this process to be as fast as 5 minutes, and you can use 30 minutes, you don't have to use any of these more harmful chemicals. And 30 minutes is still incredibly fast compared to the mushroom leather strategy and other grown protein, or definitely much faster than natural leather. And so it is our most, again, exciting strategy because its overall health performance is on a scale that is much better compared to DMF. And because it's also close to market readiness, we would recommend this as the strategy from the material change section.
So now we're going to talk just briefly about the next steps if you choose to move forward with the process or the material change. So the first one is a big one, right? So it's confirm these supplier claims. In all of the process and the material changes that we've suggested, there are still a lot of gaps, mostly because we don't necessarily believe what's on the marketing website. So we see pictures of beautiful material, but we want to just make sure that that material would hit the very high performance and aesthetic requirements of Nike, but also that the hazard tables that we've presented are accurate, right? That they're not slipping anything else in there. And then the feasibility. Frequently, right, startups especially, right, are like, we're ready to go tomorrow. And it's like, okay, you can make one purse, but maybe not, a million shoes or whatever you need to make. The other part here is the pair with the CO2 dyeing. Both the polyurethane dispersion and some of the grown leathers might have issues with getting the color palette that Nike desires. So there is this cool new process called CO2 dyeing to try to achieve that color palette, and Nike already has made a large investment in that. So that would be a really cool way to combine those and eliminate that as a con of some of these strategies.
So our overall recommendation in both process and material change, which we have presented several options. All of these options are improvements on hazard compared to the current DMF and PU process. And based on being the most appealing and interesting, we're recommending PU dispersion and natural fiber welding as our top 2 recommendation for these 2 categories. And we would also like to recommend perhaps a reframe of marketing strategies. Nike might consider putting out pilot limited edition series using new materials such as the mushroom leather, and we have named this product the Mushroom Air Max. So
This is trademarked by Kim.
yes, trademarked by Kim. And
I would wear them.
so this strategy will be able to test the scalability as well as customer perception to a greener product.
Okay, awesome. So now we've kind of today walked you through 3 different spaces in potentially reducing or hopefully eliminating the use of DMF, and we just kind of want to round up with some final thoughts. So everything that we presented today, we think they are overall improvements to DMF. And so moving forward, while we did mention kind of some caveats and steps moving forward, if Nike chooses to move forward with these solutions, the things we'd recommend are those recommended drop-in candidates, natural fiber welding, and PU dispersion. And then just thinking on kind of broader impacts of this project in general, Nike is a huge kind of force in the fashion and shoewear industry. So if they choose to kind of make a bold change, we do think that it could drive industry change. And then also in kind of thinking about the material change, and if Nike did choose to make kind of an investment in some of these smaller startup companies that are making alternative leathers, it could create the precedent for biodegradable synthetic leathers. And then just overall, DMF is used in a lot of other processes, not just PU synthetic leather. So we do think kind of the research gone into this project on finding alternatives and potential changes by Nike could kind of have broader impacts for the global use of DMF. And we wanted to thank you all for listening. We wanted to give special thanks to Meg and Tom and Billy for their great guidance, Renee for her guidance as well, and for coming all the way down here, the other SLA team for their good feedback, and then also David Faulkner, who helped us with our modeling. And now we're open to questions.
Yeah. We're gonna dial in our chemist.
If you have chemistry questions.
Do we have
His
the
airline changed his
slides?
flight without his permission, so he's back home.
He's in customs right now, I think.
Not custody. I thought you were gonna
Not
say
custody, customs.
Questions from India. That was amazing. Thank you so much for the incredible hard work that you've done. This is bigger than Nike, right? This is something that really needs to happen in the industry. I really enjoyed and understood the approach that you took, and I think that there's great options for the industry to look at. So I have one
Sorry.
So the question was really around.
I don't know if I have sound.
Oh, can you hear it?
I can hear you all.
Okay, great. We can hear you.
The question was
Oh,
really.
wonderful. Hello, everybody.
Sorry.
I'm sorry I couldn't be here due to American Airlines.
Okay.
But
Thank you, Isaac. We have a question from the crowd.
So as you rightly pointed out, polyurethanes, it's not only about DMF, right? It's about isocyanates. I really liked your recommendation around eliminating diisocyanates from the reaction. This is a very simple question. If that happened, it wouldn't be polyurethane, would it?
So urethanes are a really broad class of chemicals because the only thing required to make something a polyurethane is that one polyurethane linkage that we showed, right? So it's only a couple of molecules in the whole linkage. So I do think that there is opportunity as we go through a million slides.
We are switching over. We don't want to give you like motion sickness trying to get through our Prezi. So
But this is all that's required to make something a polyurethane. This linkage right here. So yes, I think that it might become something else if you switch this whole molecule, but I do think that there could still be opportunity to change the formulation of that part of the region.
But maybe this is the chemist. If you eliminate diisocyanates, can you still get that thing in red?
Yes.
Okay.
And there is people who are doing this.
Okay.
Yeah. So we didn't include a lot of that literature because it was kind of out of the scope of this presentation, but there are people who are making urethane linkages with other chemicals versus the isocyanate.
That's
Yeah,
really
actually, just to follow up on that IPEG and on the isocyanates, because that is another challenge within our material supply chain is isocyanates. We use them in a bunch of other places too.
Yep.
But
It's really interesting. Isn't it?
It's another chemistry that we're trying to figure out. We can't always manage it, so how can we get rid of it?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
It's very thoughtful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I would echo that. It's amazing, particularly your awareness of what's needed in the market and what's ready, what's market ready and what would need more work, but it still has an opportunity like this. And really the thinking behind this of looking to see what's driving the use of DMF, I think that was a really key piece. This question may be out of the scope of your project too, but I didn't really understand what PU dispersion was. Could you talk about that approach, or is that beyond? What does it do? How does it work?
So synthetic leather, which I don't have an example of right now, right, so it's a backbone and then there's layers of the polyurethane. And so any polymer, you polymerize it in a mixture. So the thing that makes the PU in synthetic leather really interesting is actually the foamy texture. And so that is really critical. And so that foamy texture is actually created by the addition of water in the ingredients list. So in that that bath that has DMF, it's really the water that actually makes carbon dioxide, which creates bubbles and creates that foaming texture. So my understanding of this process, other people who might know more in the room, is that you're just using the water, and then the reaction the polymerization happens without an additional solvent. But trying to get the long chain length is what drives up all of the mechanical properties of those polymers, and so that's why you have to have the water dispersing monomer in there. And that's also why solvents are used, right? Because they get the monomers to keep reacting and keep growing those.
So you're trying to get PU onto the leather.
You're trying to get PU onto that leather.
Yeah,
DMF.
yeah, exactly.
And I think they're commercially available, right?
So we do use an aqueous hydro PU dispersion for our natural leather. So we do that. Here's an example. For natural leather, it is PU water hydro PU. It's that other layer that's a challenge for the hydro, because that bubbling sponginess is what makes synthetic leather natural leather like. It's giving it that kind of structure piece of it.
So it's doing two things. You're applying PU, but it's also changing the structure.
Yeah, it's complicated.
For the persistent issues that you were finding with the, I can't remember exactly what you're calling it,
PB.
but with some of the alternative bio-based, did you guys consider microbe communities that could help with that, or any kind of mixtures that might improve persistent problems?
So maybe Isaac will also want to chime in on this, but I think in general there was not a lot of data. And so all of the persistence data I think that we showed was actually just based on looking at that structure and looking at how many ester and ether bonds and trying to make an assumption about, do we think that this would break down in water mostly.
Yeah, and that would be a great exploration if I think we narrowed down to maybe just one. It's kind of hard to do that work with 5 or 18. But we have another SPPS that does perform even better in terms of the environmental health aspects, but this one met our criteria for the technical performance. But we've kind of explored, but it's out of the scope for this project. We looked at each one individually. But you can definitely play around with ratios and mix some of these similar solvents to get that better health profile, but still maintain the technical performance. It's not something that we're doing a ton of work in, but it's a space that could be moved into. Isaac, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
If you're there. I think that somehow by plugging you into the room system, I silenced you. So let's try. Oh, here we go. There we go. Try again, Isaac. Nope. Okay,
I might
I'm
have
going
to
to unplug you.
him.
Yeah, go ahead. Try again. Can you?
Yes.
It's quiet, but.
I missed the original question.
It was a question on persistence and how did we predict persistence and did we look at different environments?
Oh, no, I think you answered that accurately.
Okay.
Okay.
I have
But-
another question, sorry. Did you consider different types of shoes? So like Stephanie has a pair on, Kim, you also have a different pair on. There's also, like running shoes, there's soccer cleats. So did you take in the different kinds of shoes that have to be considered when looking at these different things?
No. I think if we had found any material properties of any of the alternatives, we might have tried to make a comparison for different types of shoes. But I think based on where the literature is right now, no. Just
I'm really intrigued by this mushroom right here. I'm like putting that in my soccer cleat. Seeing what would happen. I'm also kind of grossed out by it though.
Yes.
And this is actually less probably a question for you guys, but maybe for Meg and Tom and the other teachers. To what extent have you, EPA has a number of tools where if you take a chemical structure, it can, you can do some of the modeling about physical chemical properties as well as, persistence and by, able to calculate the log KW and some of those other things if it's not known. And I'm wondering if you guys.
I'm so glad you asked.
We have
I wanted to hear while we're all in the same room, both teams.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We both
Consistently,
kind of
both said,
landed on the same.
Modeling didn't really work for us. And I also want to hear why why modeling didn't work, and B, what would work, or what did you need that you didn't get?
Sure.
We're going to start at the top because we almost included a longer rant about modeling, but we decided to stay positive. So we're really, so modeling is really only good for like small molecules, and we were like, this is great because that's what we're looking at here for these solvents. Are these like small? They could be made from petroleum-based molecules. So we actually tried to use a variety of modeling softwares. Vega, OECD. The EPA Comtax has the best, user interface, so snaps to that. But one of our biggest problems was inconsistent data. So we're talking inconsistent by many orders of magnitude from the same software for all of the model data, but also inconsistent from the many orders of magnitude different from any cases where it had experimental data for that solvent. So we didn't really have any kind of certainty bars on any of that data, which is why we didn't choose to present it. Especially for the DMF alternatives, we also wanted to look at the metabolites because at the very beginning we showed you that liver, and so we know that DMF is toxic because of the metabolites that are created in the liver. So we were like, okay, well maybe we can't predict the tox of the actual solvents, but maybe we can look at what it might metabolize into. And we also found that that was like pretty unhelpful. OECD actually has a full toolbox, and it actually predicted quite a few metabolites, but we didn't have any health data on any of those, and also they when you put those back in, they just went back and forth. Right? It was one of those like circular pathways.
Like
Yeah.
I think it kind of comes down to there's not enough to pull from to model with these brand new chemicals as well. And so what it's getting closest to often is like DMF. And so you're like kind of modeling a lot of the same things there. We spoke with David Faulkner extensively, and we thought that this was going to be like a winning strategy of like modeling the metabolites. But I think in terms of a one semester project, it kind of requires a bit more of a bigger lift to accomplish and really narrow down like what is the most salient information, because it just throws a lot at you, and it can be a little overwhelming to try and distill it into something that's useful. So yeah, I don't know if that captures.
This is an interesting experience in that for me personally, because what what we're often teaching is sort of the thing about computational toxicology is sort of you have to have good enough comparison data to be able to make predictions about unknown chemicals, and that's what Kim is saying basically is when your nearest neighbor is DMF, and then you're taking the toxicity data of DMF to stand in for the toxicity of your unknown, you don't have good enough comparisons. So it's such an illustration to me of the point that I think comes up a lot in the field much more generally, that won't CompTox solve all our problems because it can fill in gaps where we don't have data. But if you don't have data to feed a model,
Yeah.
you can't generate a model from it.
Yeah.
And is this group willing to yield back time to?
Oh, hang on one
Sorry.
sec. I think
Isaac's gonna chime in,
Yeah,
but then
Isaac does
we'll
have a note about modeling. We did
Yeah.
talk about this yesterday.
Yeah.
No, I would just add to that when it does these predictions for various endpoints, it does show you what it thinks the similar molecules are, and you can look at the things in the database that it thinks are similar and see immediately that most of them are actually not really structurally that similar, and you wouldn't really expect them to behave the same way.
Yeah.
Just by looking at their structure, how their chemistry will work out. We did do, you mentioned physical properties as well, and some of those have been modeled. Those are, I would say, overwhelmingly more successful. You usually get things that agree with experiment pretty closely. But for the metabolites and the health stuff, that was a bigger challenge.
But the physical was easier to measure anyway.
Right.
So-
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
But I think if we had another semester and an expert to work
Yes.
with closely, it could be, great. But it's just a lot to take on in addition to all of this. Yeah.
And potentially programs that are, like, we used all the free programs that are available, like open source, if potentially, like, with guidance, with programs that maybe you have to pay for but work a little bit better, it could be more successful.
You guys want to reflect a little bit on your experience with modeling? Because you had it, for different reasons, you had an unrevealing time with your comp talks.
I can just say that most of the polymer, we used mostly polymer backbones for a lot of these, and like they said, it's more useful for small molecules, but we tended to use very large molecules, and then we functionalize them with methacrylates, for instance. So it was hard to, I tried to draw the polymer, but obviously if I just draw a short strand of it, that's not representative. But if it was a 700 monomer chain of them, so I don't know if you guys have anything else to add.
Yeah, we did it with chitosan and methacrylic acid, and I think it just presented the nearest neighbor, which was just chitosan, without the part that we were concerned about.
I have a question for you, and again, just to echo the point that Anne made about how informative and just artfully done this was. Thank you. And that is on your recommendations. Is it practical, sort of in terms of the industrial process, to think of it as a sequence, sort of a initial, taking the first step being a drop-in substitute for in the examples that you've done here as a near-term goal, and then with the longer-term goal being this bio-based material and sort of you look at these more sustainable kinds of both processes and materials. So sort of a two-step approach. And if that's practical, the problem of neurotoxicity, endocrine disruption, and endocrine disruption, how would you solve that problem? If you were thinking, okay, well, we're going to do a drop-in substitute. Let's start there. How do you answer that data gap? How would you solve that?
So, as we've mentioned, Nike has a goal of phasing out DMF by 2025. So I think a drop-in is an immediate action that, that they're looking to take, and it could happen both in conjunction or before or after, or in terms of our process and material change. I don't think that has to be sequenced per se, especially when they're dealing with contracted manufacturers, right? Nike doesn't own any of their own manufacturing plants. So in terms of addressing those data gaps, I think what our challenge was, or what we saw our role was really giving the best direction to move forward with. But Nike does have their own, they work with Cyvera, right, for their green screening. And so they could take, our top 5 and move that into that process, maybe after technical performance criterias are met, or I'm curious actually to hear from Renee on that as well. Yeah.
It would be parallel.
Yeah.
So looking at some of our more friendly synthetic leather suppliers switching to one of the drop-ins, and then in parallel developing some of these other ones. And everyone kind of chuckled at the mushroom Air Max. I would call it the shroom Air Max.
Oh.
We do have enough, we have small design houses within the bigger behemoth monsters individual, they do 2,000 run productions. And so they have a lot more freedom to take a shroom leather or the natural fiber welding type thing and see if it is even feasible in our factory situation, right? And how many of those end up scaling, not sure, but there is that opportunity. And with a renewed focus on sustainability, now is a really good time to you know, look at these things. I will say we're looking at the shroom leather mostly from the carbon negative aspect of it. So we have an innovation team that is putting it kind of through the due diligence cases to see if that can fit within our model.
Yeah, can I just build on that as well? The great thing about shroom leather is that it separates Nike from its competitors, right? It allows them to be first to market. But within the textile industry, there's an enormous appetite around new fibers and new materials. And there's actually a stakeholder group in Amsterdam called Fashion for Good that's really promoting and supporting new innovations and trying to scale green chemistry. So it's a wonderful industry to be in if you're an innovator. So it's you know, the DMF it's not a Nike challenge, right? It's an industry challenge. But shroom leather, it can give a competitive advantage to a brand if they're willing to put the effort and financial work into it. But there's also other ways to scale and promote and bring green chemistry to the market.
Can I have a follow-up question for Renee? Sorry, yeah, and that would be just sort of this other piece of it. How would you sort of address that data gap problem of neurotoxicity around, you know, if you start moving this parallel path and a drop-in substitute?
Yeah, and we would definitely want to look at that because we don't want to have some regrettable substitutions. They mentioned that, you know, we've had some vendors say, oh, we'll just switch out DMF or DEF. Like, please don't. At least if you're using DMF, we're tracking that. And, I think we'd have to, you know, pick one or two of these and really, you know, either dig deeper for some information or partner with identify. I mean, I think we want to know for sure that there isn't a problem.
One thing that I would add to that is we're only able to get to publicly available data.
Right.
And so particularly with things that are used in like a pharmaceutical setting, manufacturers have data.
Yeah,
and so you could get
anybody who sells in the EU, they have all that information because they have to provide that data to be able to.
So we have no way of getting, you know, those data gaps are data gaps to us, but they may not be true world data gaps, which is a window into whole other problems. But in terms of your ability to get some information to decide whether to
and they mentioned that we use Cypera as a third-party toxicology firm. We have agreements with a lot of the vendors we work with that they can provide us that readout without giving us the ingredients. But so then we can look at their formulation and say, oh, okay, it doesn't have any of these endpoints that we're concerned about. We still don't know exactly what it is necessarily, but it's been a good way to get us at least some information, so that we're knowing we're not making a regrettable substitution. We would like full formulation disclosure, but you know, we're not there yet. So that's one of the, we have a, you know, basically they give us the readout with all those endpoints, and so then we can make a call on whether or not we want to move forward with that. And we will push back if something flags that is something we're concerned about. We will push back and say, you need to tell us what that is. So that's how makes it good.
Yeah. I just kind of a follow up on that, and then maybe it's a question to you guys as well as to Nike, which is, you know, it's interesting to me that given that it's recognized as an industry issue and there are commitments or promises to move away from DMF, to the extent that there aren't companies coming out of the woodwork offering their safer alternatives, either as a drop-in replacement or as a, you know, we can make the same leather in a greener way. But did you guys run across those?
So
it sounds like you.
So two of our bio-based solvents were in the industry. They had a couple different like news articles and like a very low number of citations.
Styrene and GBL.
Styrene and GBL, where they had been used as a DMF replacement in another reaction. There was no literature that talked about like replacing DMF in polyurethane production. There's actually not very many papers in like academic literature about synthesizing polyurethane and talking about what the solvents are at all.
So it sounds like you guys didn't necessarily run into it. I don't know if you have salesmen knocking on your door.
What they've told us is once you make the public commitment isn't a public commitment yet, it will
Right.
be in June. Once you make the public commitment, then we'll do the necessary back channel stuff to provide you that. But until you do, we're not going to make, and so it's chicken and egg thing.
Right.
So,
And just so
they're
that's
definitely looking,
there are people out there working on it,
yeah.
but you also, it sounds like you guys also need it at a certain scale. It's not like Nike's going to create its own chemical company and its own polyurethane leather company.
Right.
That you have to go out and find somebody who's going to do that for you, right?
Yeah, true. And like I said, we do have these opportunities for these small scale projects
Okay.
that
Cool.
can scale longer term. So we don't, they're not widely known because
So
but there is that opportunity to
consistently,
tinker more.
you use them as pilot.
Yeah.
To pilot things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if when you guys looked at Cyrene, I mean that's a great example of academic industry partnership, right? University of York and Merck. But that took some time to develop. Do you recall how long that took? Obviously, they saw something. They saw a need, or Merck must have looked at it and said, "This is really a winner." So here we are.
Yeah, the big document that we found that was kind of it was like a multi-100-page document on a lot of the bio-based solvents, and it kind of talked about all of the chemistry from how do you go from glucose to the final solvent chemistry. Made a really nice chart at the end that actually included feasibility, and they had 3 different categories, and it's is the feedstock available? And of course, all of these are made out of glucose, so they were like, we have glucose, but then they had these other categories for has it been made at an industrial scale production, and then has it been made at a commercial scale production? And they tried to make a clear distinction for like that those are 2 different orders of magnitude that we're talking about there. And I think the only one of the 3 bio-based that we talked about that had actually been made at any kind of scale at the point of the publication of this really comprehensive document was DMI. So Cyrene was in the document but had not been made. GVL was even further behind, right? It was like 1+, right? Like the maximum is 3, and they had like 1+ in that category, and GVL actually had like a +/-.
But for Cyrene, it's not clear kind of where they are, or I can't recall how long it took, but from what I understand, like the way they're marketing it now is not specific to this process. They're looking at like making graphene manufactured like much more quickly, or these other processes that's not PU leather, to my understanding. But if it is like a growing thing, it could be maybe it's on its way to being produced at scale. I'm not really sure. Yeah.
What is the reference that you were
It's the Dutch paper.
It was published in 2011.
Yeah, we can find the citation for you. Yeah.
The citation, include it somehow.
But it's the bio-based alternatives to polar A products.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So obviously the bio-based solvents are very attractive for many reasons, but do you know how compatible they are with the actual like synthetic or industrial process in terms of like chemical and thermal stability and these kind of things? Because I feel like that might be one of the concerns with bio-based.
Yeah, we did not try to do any sort of chemical stability. We only tried to look at the liquid range and try to get on the same order as DMF, but we did not look at any sort of chemical degradation of these.
And I think that kind of goes back to us not knowing the exact process that's happening in the CMs, in the manufacturing process, because there's a lot of them, and we don't have the proprietary knowledge of what the exact processes are, what the temperatures are that they're being baked at, any of that. So we kind of we took a different approach, which you saw.
But I think, right, any of the 5 that we recommended, that would, right, be an obvious next step to try to look at. Yeah.
Question. So one of the problems with the sort of traditional hydrocarbon solvents is as I understand it, there can be synergistic effects with when you add 2 or 3 together, it amplifies the health outcome, sometimes by a couple orders of magnitude or more. And so So I'm wondering if you ran into that at all, thinking through some of these alternative sort of drop-in solvents, if there were, like in the manufacturing process that's applicable here, were there mixture problems that that you identified or that sort of needed to be sort of fleshed out?
I think that they all need to be fleshed out. I think the idea that there was a plethora of papers on any of these chemicals as solvents is the wrong assumption. But
I like the way you phrase it. Well done.
But I think that like mixtures could be really exciting, right? To try to balance maybe GVL actually like that potential concern. Maybe that is a real concern, but maybe it's less than DMF, and maybe if we mix it with something like DMI, you can get the same technical performance, but you can cut your health performance, cut the risk in half.
Right.
Oh boy, we got feedback.
Oh, that's fun.
Sorry, we're getting some feedback here. My attempt was to unmute participants on Zoom and offer you a chance to ask a question. That was not so successful. You could potentially message us on Zoom. I think what we were getting was just feedback. So actually, if we're quiet for a sec, I will unmute. And nope, sorry. Okay, it's not going to work. Okay, not going to work. No luck. Isaac, do you have anything else you want to add?
To the question of the mixtures and stuff?
Or to any?
Yeah, do you want to rephrase or restate your question for?
Yeah, sure. It was just if you ran across any sort of problems or questions around mixtures of the particular solvents that you were looking at as they're applied in the manufacturing process, sort of amplifying the health effects, for example.
So, I mean, I think the response that we don't have a great understanding of how various solvents are mixed in these manufacturing steps is important. I don't know if I have anything else to add. We do think that looking at mixtures is an interesting step and could have some promise for mitigating some things, but that's really, I think, well beyond the scope of what we've been able to do with this. But it's certainly something that one should absolutely consider because you can get around a lot of potential issues that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's our understanding that even if Nike dropped in a different solvent for DMF, that in the process there still is toluene or MEK, and we're not looking at like the cumulative effect for worker exposure, but just via single solvent by solvent or chemical by chemical analysis, which is how we had to approach our hazard assessment. There are concerns around that, but I know Nike is looking at like all of these problematic chemistries and looking at solvents kind of as a class, is my understanding. But and that's why I think we're excited about some of these alternative materials and process changes that can really get us away from solvents completely. Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
I just wanted to congratulate everyone on a really well done job. I mean, it's amazing the kind of research that you did, and your presentations were fantastic. I took the very first British Solutions course a long time ago. So it's awesome to see how it's grown through the years. I work now for the Safer Consumer Products program at the Department of Toxic Substance Control. And I just wanted to let you know, if you're interested, that we are going to have some internships, like summer internships for undergrad and grad students, as well as a lot of some entry-level positions. We want to get interns and train the next generation of green chemists. So if you're interested, let me know.
Great, thank you.
TTC is hiring.
Yeah, we have 2 interns right now who are awesome, and we want to bring in more.
Do you have to live in Sacramento for that?
Maybe, maybe not. Ideally, yes. But we also have, so these internships, some of them are going to be through the university. So we're going to partner with universities. So if you're a university student, then you would have probably the opportunity to also work on campus. And we have an office in Berkeley as well.
John, did you say?
Yeah, I just had another, I guess, and this is, it always is amazing when I come to these, like, we have grad students doing this work, and it speaks to the inherent conservatism of the chemical industry, that and maybe they're boutique shops out there who are creating these great new molecules to do this work that you guys are coming up with, but it's not like they're busting down the door of industry to say we've got a new and better way and it's going to be taken up. So there's probably conservatism throughout the whole system, but I think it's just great that you guys, to the extent that we're a smaller audience here, but have a willing partner in the companies that come here to help kind of push some of that innovation into the system, because the system is inherently, seems to me, every time I come to these, and it's always a different industry. It's not just apparel, right? It's
building.
Yeah, everything. It's like there's just this inherent, like, this is the way we've done it. It's cheap, it's fast, it works, and the level of innovation you need to try to get change in there is just sobering. But I think you guys, it's really important that you're doing this, and that the companies who come to the program are willing to listen, because it's needed.
Which is exactly why we have several sessions on the policy background to this whole setting, and what's the, this is the supply side. This is like a progressive industry saying, we want something safer, even though there's nobody telling us we can't use this. But there's this other side, which is like the demand side of, could we have a regulatory setting that demands safer alternatives and raises that regulatory floor so that it doesn't just take industry leaders to go out and go above and beyond.
Well, and what I'm always wondering is, where are the Haas people who see the business opportunity in a green chemistry company? But it's just, I think because it's very resource intensive and capital intensive and that kind of thing, and they're big incumbents, it's hard. But it's just, it seems like there's such a business opportunity for these greener chemistries, but getting them to scale is a challenge. So anyway, I applaud you guys for keeping to push the python through the elephant. Or the elephant through the python.
Either way, it sounds hard. Well, I want to acknowledge this team in particular, for you can hear that they struggled mightily with data gaps of all kinds. Even getting to understand the PU manufacturing process and which specific PU film they were working, that system that they're working in, and identifying potential alternatives, and then getting any tox data on anything. And what you see here is the result of their really, really working with those data gaps and at all points of the analysis, and how to get very creative and make comparisons where possible. And also did a lot of grappling with winnowing down, choosing representative molecules, choosing representative solutions. And I think for both teams, what you see here is just what rose to the top as the most successful candidates, and behind that is a whole well of work that they did on other alternatives, other ideas that didn't make it, that didn't rise to the top as either very feasible, or they had some, damning characteristic in terms of their environmental health performance. And so what you see here is impressive, and behind it lies a whole body of work also that got them to this subset of possible solutions, and that's true for both teams. And so I do want to really applaud both teams' work. It was such a pleasure to have this class this semester, and as Simona mentioned, this was our 8th year offering the course, and it's just like every year we're floored. And so thank you for putting in all the effort and time, and having the sort of intellectual humility to wade into difficult questions where there's a lot of uncertainty, and to work with each other when sometimes you don't understand what the other person is talking about. Might in some settings feel diminished for it, but having sort of the courage to go into that space and learn from each other and teach each other. So it was an inspiring process for me, and I hope also for all of you. And I want to thank again all of our students.